The Jedi Order was one of the most ancient orders of Force users in the galaxy, having operated under more or less the same doctrine and general hierarchy for more than 25,000 years. Naturally, an ideology that's been around for so long would see variation over the years, however, and in the Jedi Order, this manifested in the form of sects within the Jedi Order. Some of these were like fellowships within the Order, informal groupings of Jedi with similar interpretations of Jedi doctrine or approaches to the Jedi way. Others were subgroups of the Order, some authorized by the Council and some not. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the most significant of these Jedi sects, from the most well-known to the obscure.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
We're going to start by looking at the three main branches of the Order: the Guardians, Sentinels, and Consulars. These three groups represented a different approach to and philosophical outlook on what it meant to be a Jedi Knight, and they represented the main internal ideological distinctions between Jedi. These three branches all worked together well despite their differences. They were specializations rather than competing sects. They differed primarily in tactics and their approach to the Force, and in overall ideology, they were generally the same, all being followers of the light and adherents of the Jedi Code. Each branch had its own traditions, and traditionally, members of the three branches were identified by the colors of their lightsabers. Guardian sabers had blue blades, Consulars had green blades, and Sentinels had yellow blades, though this was just a tradition and not a rule, and Jedi were still free to choose whatever color they wanted. The Jedi Guardians, the largest sect, believed in direct action as a solution to injustice, and focused on honing their combat skills and physical capabilities. The Jedi Consulars were revered all over the galaxy as diplomats and arbiters, trained primarily in non-combat related techniques. The smaller sect, the Jedi Sentinels, adopted a sort of hybrid approach, focusing on learning as many skills as they could so as to root out the dark side wherever it could be found. We'll focus on the Jedi Guardians first. In the words of Jedi Guardian Crix Sunburus, the Guardians were the Republic's first line of defense against the 1,000 enemies that sought to destroy it, and just the way that's phrased speaks volumes about the Guardians' view of the galaxy. The Guardians were fighters, and they specialized in the use of physical force to bring an end to injustice. Some Guardians saw themselves as warriors, but this was something wiser Jedi cautioned against. Guardians were still Jedi, after all, and they were called to use violence only when necessary to protect the lives of the innocent. The Guardians nonetheless had a more offense-oriented and direct approach to this than the other branches of the Order. Consequently, they prioritized skill in lightsaber combat more than the other branches did, and they also emphasized physical fitness and combat readiness. Guardians' study of the Force typically focused on techniques that were applicable in combat. In a sense, the Jedi Guardians were what many people's first impression of a Jedi Knight was. They traveled the galaxy, battling pirates, slavers, and darksiders wherever they could be found, acting as keepers of the peace and protectors of the innocent on the fringe of Republic space. During the Sith Wars, the Guardians fought on the front lines against armies of the dark side. When evil reared its head, it was usually the Guardians that would respond first, charging in with lightsabers blazing. When not out on missions, Guardians spent most of their time engaged in rigorous training exercises, with most spending no less than 3 hours a day running, sparring, and practicing saber cadences or unarmed combat drills. As a result, Guardians were typically the physically strongest Jedi, as well as generally the most skilled in lightsaber combat. They used the Force to bolster these skills, enhancing their strength, speed, and resistance to pain. Generally, they were the most skilled in combat-oriented Force abilities, such as the aforementioned performance-enhancing techniques, Force jump and similar abilities, and offensive telekinetic techniques. All told, Guardians were the Jedi you'd want by your side in a fight. They were typically less prepared for non-combat situations, however. Guardians often neglected their study of the Force techniques that didn't have combat applications, or of non-combat skills, disciplines, and teachings, and when subtlety or negotiation were necessary, Guardians usually weren't the best choice. Some Guardians were further specialized, filling specific roles within the Jedi Order. The most well-known Guardian subgroup was the Jedi Peacekeepers, who were more like patrolmen than warriors. the most prestigious of whom were the members of the Temple's security, the Jedi tasked with protecting the Jedi Temple, whose ranks included the Gate Master. There were also Jedi Aces, gifted pilots who specialized in using the Force to excel in starfighter combat. The Jedi's lightsaber instructors were usually Guardians, appointed by the High Council and handpicked by the most skilled and experienced Jedi Guardian of each Jedi Academy, who was given the title of Jedi Battlemaster. Other skilled Guardian Jedi Masters were given the title of Warrior Master, which was mostly honorary and simply identified a particularly skilled Guardian. Many Warrior Masters were also members of the last sect of Guardians, the Weapon Masters. These Jedi were masters of physical combat on a level that surpassed all other Jedi, and most devoted their lives to the mastery of a particular weapon, either a lightsaber or a more exotic weapon such as a quarterstaff, whip, flail, rare lightsaber variants, or even one's own body. Jedi weapons masters learned techniques that gave them increased strength and an innate resistance to pain, and those who chose to study the lightsaber were typically the best duelists in the Order. Moving on, we're going to discuss the Jedi Consulars next. In contrast to the Guardians, the Consulars focused on the more cerebral applications of the Force, and more than any other Jedi branch, they prioritized finding non-violent solutions to problems. Jedi Consulars were revered across the galaxy as healers, seers, and above all, negotiators. Like the Guardians, they spent their days saving lives, but while Guardians did this through direct action, Consulars could end entire wars without ever drawing their lightsabers. On the whole, Consulars were the most rational and level-headed of the Jedi, and their ranks included many of the Order's most revered members. They placed a low priority on the practice of combat techniques and the use of the lightsaber, but Consulars were unparalleled in their wisdom, knowledge of diverse topics, and in the use of the Force. Study of the Force was paramount in the life of a Jedi Consular. Most Consulars knew a wealth of Force techniques, often including several obscure ones, and they spent much of their time in meditation concentrating on the Force to better understand its will. But the Jedi Consulars were not a cloistered sect, and they too embarked on missions across the galaxy, helping the innocent wherever they could. Typically, they did this either through application of the Force, be it in combat or otherwise, or more commonly, through negotiation. Consulars were also routinely deployed as diplomats, teachers, researchers, or in other roles that allowed them to improve or even save lives without ever drawing their lightsabers. In these capacities, they often used the Force to sense deceit and ulterior motives, allowing them to cut to the chase in negotiations and create lasting peace. When combat was necessary, however, Consulars could still be quite effective. Their command of the Force made them tough opponents, allowing them to perform all sorts of techniques. The most powerful Consular techniques allowed them to rally their allies in battle, strengthening and coordinating them. And while Consulars were typically neither all that physically strong, at least for Jedi, nor the most practiced lightsaber duelists, Consulars were still Jedi, and their lightsabers were still to be feared. Some of the most devastating lightsaber duelists in the Jedi Order's history, including Yoda, Kit Fisto, and Shaak Ti, were Consulars, and while most Consulars were less skilled, they weren't pushovers by any means. Many Consulars were masters of the Niman form, which combined aspects of all the other forms of lightsaber combat to create an effective and versatile technique that paired well with creative use of the Force. Like the Guardians, the Jedi Consulars had many specialized subclasses that their members could join. The greatest of Consulars were given the title of Sage Master, and the 5 most prominent Sage Masters made up the Council of Reconciliation, one of the 4 Jedi Councils, which was solely composed of Consulars. This council worked closely with the Republic Diplomatic Corps, and all Jedi ambassadors and diplomats answered to it. Ambassadors and diplomats were 2 of the most prominent consular specializations. Ambassadors served as the face of the Republic on far-flung worlds, representing the Council and the Senate to non-Republic members, while diplomats did the grunt work of negotiation and diplomacy, both within the Republic and between its members. Other consulars were considered Jedi researchers, an umbrella term that described Jedi who devoted their lives to scholarship. They were biologists, linguists, geologists, astronomers, archaeologists, or members of some other discipline, devoting their lives to these academic pursuits, as well as study of the Force. They worked closely with the Lawkeepers, the Jedi who maintained the Order's vast archives, whose ranks included the roles of archivist, librarian, and historian. Another consular sect was the Jedi Seers, a very rare group of Jedi whose extraordinary connection to the Force gave them unusually strong insights into the Force's will and its unifying nature, allowing them to see the future. The greatest seers were the Jedi Prophets, whose visions were recorded and studied by the Lawkeepers. Lastly, there were the Jedi Healers, who did exactly what their name suggested. They used the Force to heal wounds and save lives, and they were quite good at it too. While Force healing was a fairly common Jedi technique, only the Healers were good enough to use it to full effect, bringing critically wounded beings back from the brink of death and healing those who were beyond the ability of medical science to treat. Lastly, we have the Jedi Sentinels, the rarest Jedi class. Sentinels combined elements of the Guardian and Consular paths with a heavy emphasis on learning practical, non-Force related skills as well. In the words of Jedi Master Dorak, the Sentinels ferreted out deceit and justice, bringing them to light. Sentinels were some of the most vigilant against the threat of the dark side, and in confronting this threat, they emphasized the importance of flexibility and not relying on one tactic. They spent considerable time studying both the Force and the lightsaber, but they also recognized that combat skills and the Force couldn't solve every problem, and so most Sentinels were also well versed in non-Force related skills, including many that were uncommon for Jedi. As a result, Sentinels tended to be the Jedi who got the missions neither the Guardians nor the Consulars wanted, and they became adept at solving problems that other Jedi couldn't. While Guardians and Consulars traveled the galaxy on missions, Sentinels frequently stayed in one place for extended periods of time, devoting themselves to the protection of individual worlds or communities. This led many Sentinels to become Jedi Watchmen, and even those that didn't serve as Watchmen were generally practical, capable, and equipped with a better understanding of civilian life than Jedi of other disciplines. Jedi Sentinels kept combat ready, honing their lightsaber skills and meditating on the Force, but they didn't prioritize either. Instead, their focus was typically on developing civilian skills such as stealth, slicing, infiltration, treating wounds, picking locks, and even things like espionage and sabotage. As a result, Sentinels were fairly well-rounded. When it came to combat or negotiation, a Guardian or Consular would fare better, but the wide skill sets of the Sentinels allowed them to complete the missions that more specialized Jedi just weren't suited for. They were given many of the Jedi Order's odd jobs, and out in the field, they tended to be very service-oriented, focusing on helping the people of the galaxy in ordinary, practical ways, rather than through combat or negotiation. Sentinels tended to keep a low profile and preferred more subtle uses of the Force that allowed them to remain unnoticed. The most well-known Sentinel techniques made them resistant to incapacitation and dark side Force techniques designed to instill fear in the target. As with the other two branches, Sentinels had a wide variety of subclasses. Many of these were just Sentinels that were particularly adept with a certain skill, such as Jedi Slicers, tech experts, and security experts, whose roles were fairly self-explanatory. These Jedi mastered skills that most Jedi neglected, making them invaluable when those skills were needed. Sentinels also served as the quartermasters of the Jedi Academies and as Jedi Watchmen, and Sentinels also made up the entirety of the Jedi Temple Guard, whose yellow-bladed lightsabers demonstrated their allegiance to this sect. Some Sentinels were Jedi artisans, who honored the Force by making cool stuff in their spare time, while others were Jedi investigators, who acted as detectives, trackers, and sometimes even spies on long-term missions. One of the most important Jedi Sentinel roles was that of Jedi recruiters, who went around the galaxy looking for Force-sensitive children that showed the potential to be Jedi. The last and most interesting Jedi Sentinel specialization was the Jedi Shadows, a subsect of elite Sentinels that were tasked with hunting down and eradicating all traces of the dark side. The Jedi Shadows answered to the Council of First Knowledge, which dispatched these Sentinels across the galaxy to contain or destroy darkside artifacts and apprehend or terminate Darksiders. Their missions were difficult, secretive, and extremely dangerous, and due to the nature of their role, Jedi Shadows were allowed to study darkside techniques beyond what would normally be allowed for Jedi, as they stood a high chance of having to defend themselves against them. Additionally, Jedi Watchmen were sometimes considered an extension of the Sentinel discipline, and while not all Watchmen were Sentinels, many were. We've talked about the Watchmen already in this series, but for the sake of completeness, let's take a quick look at them again. Jedi Watchmen were appointed as the permanent guardians of particular planets or systems, or in some cases, whole sectors. In any case, they worked closely with the local governments and oversaw all Jedi operations within their designated theater. Watchmen worked closely with the Council of Reconciliation, as they tended to be very familiar with local cultures and political situations within their theater of influence. In older eras, Jedi Watchmen would form their own little Jedi academies, selecting students from among their planet's population and training them as Jedi. These apprentices would assist the Watchmen in protecting the people of that particular planet or sector. In later eras, Jedi Watchmen weren't permanently stationed in their territories, but they continued to act as special envoys and protectors of the regions they were assigned to. Speaking of Jedi sects we've already mentioned, let's return to the Jedi Lords. During the New Sith Wars, as Republic authority began to collapse, large swaths of the galaxy were left in a state of anarchy. With a lack of Republic support and the failure of the HoloNet, these worlds were cut off from their neighbors and from galactic trade. Many sank into poverty and chaos, and the receding borders of the Republic left them at the mercy of pirates, slavers, and Sith. But many Jedi were unwilling to leave these sectors to their fate, and these Jedi set out to act as the protectors of these rimwood sectors. They initially acted as classical Jedi Watchmen, but as the years went on and their home sectors came to rely entirely on them for defense, they were granted political power and even hereditary estates. They became Jedi Lords, titles they passed down to their children in a quasi-feudal system. The traditions of the Jedi Lords varied from lordship to lordship, but they were generally independent and often bent the rules of the Jedi Order, much to the displeasure of the High Council, which frequently clashed with the Lords. The Lords established their own council, the Jedi Grand Council, which consisted of the galaxy's Jedi Lords. This council coordinated the Jedi Lords' efforts against the Sith, and in 1010 BBY, it united the forces of the Lords under the banner of the Army of Light, led by Seneschal Hoth. This army was divided into the 7 Legions of Light, each led by one of the most powerful Jedi Lords. Within each legion were several minor lords, as well as the knights and apprentices loyal to them, and the non-Jedi armies the Lords had amassed over the years. The Army of Light ultimately destroyed the Sith in the Ruusan campaign, but it suffered grievous losses in the campaign's final battle, and it was disbanded following the Ruusan Reformation. The Reformation also abolished the Jedi Grand Council and the Jedi Lordships. Most Jedi Lords subsequently gave up their titles and assimilated back into the Order, though they continued to keep a close eye on their home sectors. A few Lords stubbornly persisted for a short while, but in a matter of decades, the Jedi Lords had died out. Their legacy, however, survived in the form of 2 Jedi subsects, the Corellian Jedi and the Tipo Paladins. Now's the point where we begin to talk about actual Jedi sects, groups within the Order with controversial or heterodox views on some topics. All the sects we're going to be talking about today were still in harmony with the Council and upheld the code to some degree, though the Council still didn't like most of these sects. Thus, we won't be discussing any fallen Jedi groups or sects like the Potentium that the Council considered heretical. We'll start with a subgroup that exemplifies the kind of Jedi sect we're going to be talking about from here on out, the Corellian Jedi. Also known as the Green Jedi, the Corellian Jedi were a group of Jedi from Corellia who maintained a strong sense of Corellian identity. They were loyal to their homeworld over the Republic and were, as Corellian Jedi Coran Horn put it, notoriously contrary and bent on going their own way. They operated separately from the rest of the Order, working out of a Jedi enclave on Corellia, and they rarely took missions outside of the Corellian sector. All told, the Green Jedi mostly fit the stereotype for Corellians. They were stubborn, patriotic, suspicious of non-Corellians, and firmly committed to their own ways. This repeatedly brought the Corellian Jedi into the High Council, though the Corellian Jedi remained part of the Jedi Order and continued to follow the Jedi Code. Nonetheless, the Corellian Jedi had a few traditions that set them apart from other Jedi. Most famously, they wore green robes, as green was the traditional national colour of Corellia, and they also allowed their members to have romantic relationships and start families, leading to the development of long bloodlines, powerful Corellian Force sensitives. The Corellian Jedi typically followed the Corellian government's lead in galactic politics. When Corellia enacted Contemplanis Hermi, an ancient clause of the Galactic Constitution that allowed it to recuse itself from Republic affairs and close the borders of the Corellian sector to the outside galaxy, the Corellian Jedi typically followed suit. This most notably happened during the Clone Wars, when Corellia used the clause to remain neutral in the conflict. However, a number of Corellian Jedi broke ranks over this policy and followed the lead of the Jedi Council in fighting in the conflict. The Corellian Jedi were ancient, and in their original form, they were all but destroyed by the Sith during the Cold War. However, they rose to new prominence during the new Sith Wars when they came under the leadership of a Corellian Jedi Lord. The reigning Jedi Lord at the time of the 7th Battle of Ruusan, Lord Barathon, was one of the 7 leaders of the Army of Light, and one of only 2 of those 7 to survive the final battle. Barathon was also among the Jedi Lords who refused to give up his title. After the Ruusan reformations, he and his followers returned to Corellia, where they remained stubbornly independent, if still more or less in communion with the rest of the Jedi Order. Another Jedi sect followed a similar path after the Ruusan reformations, the Tipo Paladins. These were the followers of a minor Jedi Lord named Tipo, who advocated the use of blasters and other, more common weapons alongside lightsabers. For this, and a few other heterodox beliefs, the Tipo Paladins were actually censored by the Jedi Council at one point, though they were never expelled from the Order. The Paladins were known for wearing sensory-dampening masks into battle, which heightened their connection to the Force. Little else is known about them, apart from the fact that they themselves had a more radical sect known as the Grey Paladins. The Grey Paladins were still Jedi and adherents of the light, but they believed that other Jedi were too dependent on the Force, and they regarded the Force as a secondary aspect of their lives, rather than the focal point of it. This caused considerable contention with the Council, and even with the mainstream Tipo Paladins, for obvious reasons. A somewhat similar Jedi sect was the Altessian Jedi, the followers of Jedi Master Jyn Altis. They had a number of heterodox traditions, which included allowing their members to have families and train multiple apprentices, and they also operated apart from the mainstream Jedi Order. The Altissians traveled the galaxy acting as aid workers, showing up on backwater worlds or the sites of major disasters to help those in need. Despite their unusual traditions, they still worked with the High Council on occasion, including during the Clone Wars. One of the most obscure Jedi sects, and one of our favorites, were the Iron Knights, who almost entirely adhered to the traditional teachings of the Jedi Order, but who were ostracized by the High Council for little reason other than anti-droid bias. The Iron Knights were members of an unusual sentient species from the planet Orax known as the Shards. These were crystals that, though they defied most rules of biology, were not only alive, but sentient. They were unique in many respects, and one of their unique traits was that they could enter in a sort of symbiosis with droids. When integrated into a droid's circuitry, the Shard's personality would fuse with the personality of the droid, resulting in a single hybrid entity. And like with all life forms, the Force flowed through the Shards, and some Shards were even Force-sensitive. A group of Force-sensitive Shards were trained in the ways of the Jedi by the unorthodox Jedi Master Akinos, who trained the Shards without the approval of the Jedi High Council. Akinos spent over a decade teaching his Shard students to use the Force on the frigid planet Dweem, and over time, the Shards became model Jedi. They even built their own lightsabers, using the remains of their ancestors as focusing crystals. These bizarre Jedi droids were known as the Iron Knights, and after Master Akinos granted them knighthood, they began participating in missions on behalf of the Republic. However, the concept of Iron Knights was controversial among the Jedi. Many Jedi Masters were unwilling to accept the idea of a Force-sensitive droid, or even a living crystal. They excommunicated Akinos and his apprentices for heresy, and the Iron Knights sat out the rest of the Republic era in exile on Dweem, for the most part, though a few did fight in the Clone Wars, with one falling to General Grievous in the Battle of Dagobah. Nonetheless, the Iron Knights remained loyal adherents of the Jedi Way, and they represent perhaps the strangest of all the Jedi sects. The next category of Jedi sects were groups of Jedi that you could consider the fringe radicals of the Order. Jedi whose devotion to Jedi ideology was more extreme than the High Council or the rank and files. This manifested in different ways, and in some cases, it led to corruption within these groups, drawing the members of a few down the path of the dark side. Going in reverse chronological order, let's start with the Sixth Line, who operated during the Galactic Wars. These guys were Jedi who called for adding a sixth line to the Jedi Code. There is no contemplation, there is only duty. In keeping with this, the members of the Sixth Line were real do what needs to be done types, and in the Galactic Wars, they fought tooth and nail against the Sith. They rejected the Jedi Council's tendency to carefully debate courses of action before moving against the Sith. The Sixth Line's policy was to follow what they believed the will of the Force to be without hesitation or second guessing. Perhaps surprisingly, the members of the Sixth Line never succumbed to the dark side, though they were possessed and destroyed by the Sith Emperor, so they didn't get a happy ending either. The Revanchists had a somewhat similar philosophy, and it led them to a much darker place. We've talked about these guys a billion times before, so we'll give you the short version. The Revanchists were a group of young Jedi Crusaders who followed Revan and Malak to a war against the Mandalorians, becoming generals in the Republic military. They were distinguished from the mainstream Jedi Order not by ideology, but by a difference of opinion on a single matter of policy, whether or not the Jedi should intervene in the Mandalorian Wars. While the Council said no, the Revanchists believed that this was the wrong decision, and so they went to war anyway. Ultimately, the war changed them. Revan, Malak, and all their followers were slowly corrupted by the dark side due to the brutality of the conflict, and after the end of the Mandalorian Wars, they became a new generation of Sith. Another Jedi sect operating around the same time was the Jedi Covenant. The Covenant was a secret cult within the Jedi Order entirely devoted to a single goal: preventing the return of the Sith by any means necessary. The Covenant operated primarily through watch circles, small groups of Jedi stationed across the galaxy tasked with detecting signs of a Sith resurgence. Each watch circle consisted almost entirely of Consulars, specifically seers, with the sole exception being a single guardian per watch circle who served as the executor of the watch circle, recording what the other members saw. The watch circles were tasked with probing the Force for any potential signs of a Sith resurgence, and they were stationed on the Republic's borders to serve as the first line of defense against a new Sith threat. The Jedi Covenant also operated through Covenant Shadows, secret agents who had had all identifying information about them purged from the Jedi archives and Republic records. These shadows tracked down dark-side artifacts, which they gathered in a vault at the Covenant's fortress. The Jedi Covenant was ultimately brought down from within by a dark Jedi infiltrator named Hazin, but even before that, it had been corrupted by the dark side. The members of the Jedi Covenant hated the Sith, and ironically, this slowly made the Covenant's members into Darksiders. Lastly, let's talk about the Jedi Service Corps. These weren't sects per se, but Jedi-run organizations mostly composed of Jedi washouts. In a sense, they could be considered the washout equivalent of the 3 Jedi branches we started with, but we've moved them to the end because, obviously, the members of the Service Corps weren't true Jedi, though they still had limited skill in the Force and adhered to the precepts of the Jedi Order. The most well-known Service Corps was the Agricultural Corps, whose members used the Force to nurture plants and assist in agricultural production. Though assignment to the Agri-Corps was often seen as a punishment by eager Jedi younglings, the work done by the Agri-Corps was actually crucial for many civilizations across the galaxy. The Agri-Corps helped the Republic maintain a healthy food supply for the galaxy, with Agri-Corps members assisting in the growth of crops on agri-worlds like Tanab, Dantooine, and Ukir. Without the Agri-Corps, agricultural production in the galaxy would have been substantially lessened, leading to a generally less food-secure Republic. Jedi washouts assigned to the Agri-Corps were trained to focus on the living Force, and their Force abilities were put to work cultivating crops and helping them grow. While service in the Agri-Corps was far less glamorous than service as a Jedi Knight, members of the Agri-Corps saved many lives on a regular basis, as they played a major role in preventing or alleviating famines. Next up is the Medical Corps, which was one of the smallest of the service corps, as the healing arts were well known to your average Jedi Knight. Nonetheless, there were some Jedi washouts who were assigned to serve as full-time Jedi healers. Members of the Med Corps, as you would expect, focused on preserving the living force in patients and using it to heal wounds and save lives. The skills of members of the Med Corps rivaled those of the galaxy's finest surgeons, as the Force granted healers incredible intuition when it came to deciding how to heal a patient and a broad range of options in how to heal them. The Med Corps often sent healers out across the Republic to help poorer worlds deal with plagues and the aftermaths of violent incidents. Additionally, they maintained the Halls of Healing within the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, one of the finest medical facilities in the entire galaxy, with the assistance of the Jedi healers, the aforementioned group of Jedi Consulars who devoted their lives to similar work. Full Jedi healers often acted as the leaders of the Med Corps, with Med Corps personnel acting as nurses and the healers taking the role of doctors. During the Clone Wars, most members of the Med Corps were sent off to the front lines to serve as battlefield medics, and they saved the lives of many clones over the course of the conflict. Another small service corps was the Educational Corps, in which Jedi washouts became librarians, archivists, and teachers. Members of the EduCorps helped maintain the Jedi archives on Coruscant, but they were also sent out across the galaxy to gather material for the archives or to serve as teachers on the Republic's poorer worlds. In the EduCorps, members focused on using the Force to connect with other beings for easier instruction. They also worked with some of the Jedi Consular sects, helping to maintain and expand the archives alongside the Jedi archivists, and sometimes participating in academic work alongside the Jedi researchers. The last service corps was the Exploration Corps. The Explore Corps was composed of archaeologists, researchers, xenoanthropologists, and astrocartographers, and their job was to seek out hyperspace routes, planets, and civilizations unknown to the Republic. They used the Force to find artifacts, dig sites, and above all, plot safe routes through hyperspace. Of all the service corps, the Explore Corps had the most difficult and dangerous job, but also the most exciting one. The Explore Corps' hyperspace scouts were invaluable not just to the Jedi Order, but to the Republic as well. Finding new routes through hyperspace involved making blind jumps and hoping for the best, or at least for something other than a fatal collision with a mass shadow. Through the Force, members of the Explore Corps were able to find useful routes with far greater ease than regular scouts, which provided innumerable opportunities for the Order and the Republic. The Explore Corps often performed surveys on planets they discovered, either assessing existing civilizations or analyzing evidence of ancient ones. So that's our look at the many sects of the Jedi Order. Feel free to let us know in the comments if you'd like to see full videos on any of these groups in the future. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.